As a note of caution to our listeners, please be aware that the following episode contains brief references to the topic of suicide. You're listening to Earth Keepers, a podcast for all of us who believe that earth care is a faith practice. In our honest conversations, you'll hear fresh perspectives and practical insights that help us to care for the planet and love our places. Earth Keepers is also all about looking honestly at the hard realities of climate change and at the resultant suffering of the planet. And frankly, for those of us who deeply love creation and take seriously our God-given role as caretakers and protectors of the natural world, it's right and necessary that we allow the painful truths of the ongoing crisis to break our hearts. That, of course, is the price of love. In this episode, I'll be talking with Michael Ferber and Philip Mingay about a new book, a collection of poems and essays they have edited called Climate of Lament, Reflections on Ecological Grief. Michael and Philip, and many other contributors to this volume, model for us a way to enter into the pain of having our hearts broken and show us ways in which poetry can serve as a means of expressing both individual and collective sorrow. Importantly, in its inclusion of a range of authors from diverse vocational and cultural backgrounds, Climate of Lament shows us that poetry as an expressive form can be accessed by anyone, by professional poets, but also by those average folks for whom poetry is a new language that we're learning to speak. On a personal note, I respect this kind of democratization of the poetic form, so much so that I wrote one of the forewords for the book. And in the following conversation, I'll be reading a bit of that essay. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Mike, Phil, welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate you making time to talk about this new book called Climate of Lament. Before we talk about the book, though, perhaps you could orient our listeners and maybe tell us about the sort of things you're invested in these days, as well as your relationship to the place where you live.
Well, thank you, Forrest, for the invitation, and also thank you for your contribution to the book. Well, first, I'm a professor of English. I teach post-colonial literature, and I also teach literature and art, actually. And I think a lot about the power and necessity of art and literature, especially to the young students I have in my introductory courses and so forth. I think a lot about how critical thinking through literature can go beyond literature and examine larger issues such as climate change. For me, a lot of what I think about in terms of what I'm invested in is getting people to look at art and to have it prompt you into contemplative thought. I'm originally from just north of Toronto, and I moved out here to Alberta to go to school. But I think it's a wonderful place to live, and it's where I met Mike, of course. Edmonton has the largest river valley system in North America. Mike and I would meet constantly to walk our dogs, and we could go to a different park every time we wanted to go for a walk. It didn't always have to be at the same place. And I think our ability to just walk around our city, yet still be in nature, prompted us to think about a lot of different things.
Yeah. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, so I grew up in West Virginia and have been here at Kings in Edmonton since 2008. So grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. Beautiful, beautiful place. And my journey at Kings has been kind of interesting. My PhD's in human geography. So when I first came here, I was directing the environmental studies program, teaching a physical geography course, which shows up prominently in the book. And over the last number of years, I've kind of moved through a few different disciplines. So I've had this interesting journey through the big areas of sustainability, working with community development and international development organizations on the social side of sustainability, directing an environmental studies program. And then just a few years ago in 2022, I was asked to take the role of the Dean of the School of Business. So now I'm actually on the economic side of sustainability. So I teach mostly social entrepreneurship and environmental entrepreneurship, but I continue to teach the physical geography course that I talk about in the book. And I've also been a professor for the Ensemble Institute of Environmental Studies since 2012. So Forrest, that's where we met. And I appreciate Circlewood's hosting of my class many different times, and your presence in that class has been phenomenal.
Maybe we can just get a sense of what the book is about. Phil, tell us who the book is for, and What are the hopes that you have for what people might take away from it?
Mike and I might see this differently, but I think about the necessity of creative language. I think that's one reason why the book is unique and also works so well, is because Mike and I study very different subjects at King's University. So I often think about creative language, and I think about places where you can have creative outlets. And in particular, I'm always interested in uh, ways in which you can discuss difficult topics without necessarily resorting to academic language. And I think there's a lot of academics who would like to discuss their topics, their areas of research in ways that aren't always embedded in that academic language that can at times be dry and sterile. And then sometimes I think you feel removed from your subject when you're working in that particular language. So it's a book of poetry in many ways, The Climate of Lament, but not all the contributors are poets. And lots of different people in different situations are concerned about the environment. And I think our book reflects those multitude of voices. And I also think that public expressions of grief are important. And it's my hope that the readers see their own chapter in our book, that they'll see this variety of people who live in different parts of the world and have different ways of engaging in with their own particular city or urban or rural setting. And when they read these variety of voices and locations and perspectives, they perhaps consider their own place and also then consider their own form of lament. And that's what I hope they get out of the book.
Yeah, and I have to say that when I read the draft, I was struck with the way that you were democratizing the language of lament. I mean, reading the book, reading the poems, and reading the reflections on the poems, I thought would inspire people to try their hand at writing their own poetry. You just make it look like this is something that you could do. It isn't something rarefied and academic, as you pointed out.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people are scared of poetry, and even some of our contributors maybe were, but I really think they want to.
Your other editor would be in that category as well.
And that's true. I had to say to Mike, you can do it, Mike, and I'll help you and we'll work our way through this. But you'll feel so rejuvenated and thrilled once it's actually completed.
Well, Mike, give us a bit of history for this book. How did the project come to be? How did that initial vision start, and how did it develop over time to become the project that it is now?
Sure. So it kind of emerged out of COVID when Phil and I were stuck in quarantine and all you could really do is go outside. And so we were regularly going to the dog park. And on one of our long conversations, just walking through the park, I was sharing with Phil, and we were talking about lament already. I think I'd recently read Walter Brueggemann's book, Reality, Grief, and Hope. And I was just wrestling with an experience that I'd had in 2018 at El Sable. And so we were at the top of Hurricane Ridge in Washington State in the Olympic Park. It was an extremely smoky day. Usually we take students up there and we talk about the integration between marine ecosystems and alpine ecosystems. And in this particular year, it was July 30th, 2018, when we were on Hurricane Ridge. There was a particular orca named Telequa, J35, that was a local orca that had given birth, and it was actually a stillbirth. And Beth Horvath, Dr. Horvath, who wrote the other foreword for the book, was sharing with the class, and we're connecting how important the salmon are. We're connecting how climate change is impacting those ecosystems, how overfishing is impacting the number of salmon. The orca just simply aren't getting enough fish. And Telequa had the stillbirth and was actually lamenting. This orca was grieving the loss of this child. The southern residents have been essentially going functionally extinct, and the salmon are a big part of that. And as Beth was sharing the story, it had almost been a week and a half since Telequa had birthed this orca, and she'd been carrying it on her rostrum all that time. And many of your listeners might remember this, especially those in the Pacific Northwest or in British Columbia, because it was this just horrible kind of thing where this orca had stillbirthed the baby and was just grieving it. And as Beth was sharing this story, she just began to weep. And next thing you know, I'm weeping, the other faculty are weeping, the students are weeping. There's 30 some of us in a national park in a public place with tears coming down our faces. And, other tourists are walking by just looking at us like, what's going on? And so a couple years later in COVID, Phil and I were chatting about this on that beautiful trail in a dog park in Edmonton. The idea for this book emerged.
Mike, tell us more about the authors of the book and how the diversity of voices actually relate to one another.
Sure. So Phil and I decided to put out a call for lament. So usually you do a call for papers. In this case, we did a call for lament, and we asked for authors to write a poem and then a reflection of that poem. And we sent this out to a number of different areas. So we have a lot of poets in the group, including some real heavy hitters. Like there's some amazing poetry in this volume. Many of these are big names. Some of them teach poetry. So quite an impressive group. And then you have a group of academics who are studying areas of the environment that are currently being degraded and who are lamenting that and who are looking for language. And so it was kind of fun to have a number of these academics take a crack at writing a poem and then doing the reflection. I'd be in that group as a geographer. David Rutherford from Mississippi, Joanne Moyer, who teaches environmental studies here in Edmonton, Justin Mulliken, another geographer from Kentucky, Francesca Trinetti, who teaches theology and works within a seminary, and Peter Mahaffey, who's a chemist who wrote a fantastic poem about coral reefs. So those are academics. And then we really wanted to make sure we included students. So students were a part of the beginning, the origin story of this book. They were the ones on top of the mountain. And so we in many of our classes put out invitations for students to write poetry as well. And we had quite a few that responded. And we purposely ordered the book by the author's first name. So we didn't want to separate them between whether you're an academic, whether you're a poet, whether you're a student, because we really wanted to level the playing field. And Phil, you might have some comments on this as well in terms of the poetry. This is the first poem, one of the first I've ever written, and certainly the first I've ever published. And Phil was very stubborn in making sure I included one, which I'm thankful for because I'm happy with how it turned out. But as an expert in poetry, Phil, you probably have more to add on the poetry side.
Oh, certainly. Well, in terms of structure, Mike and I frame the chapters with an introduction and conclusion. And in fact, the conclusion's quite a bit longer than the introduction, and that was deliberate to let the laments and the reflections kind of take the forefront, and that we didn't necessarily color the interpretation. So this thematically connected the chapters of the 22 contributors. As for the emphasis on poetry, despite people saying it is hard or they don't understand it, they're still drawn to it. And after every seismic event, be it cultural or political or environmental, people often turn to poetry. You often see poetry being published after particular events that traumatically and dramatically touch people. Admittedly, a lot of that poetry is not very good, but that's not the point. The point is that they are expressing themselves. In literary theory, in my field, literature is often referred to as language made strange. And there's a theorist, Terry Eagleton, and he talks about how literature forces us into an awareness of language and forces us to grapple with it in new ways, and subsequently also grapple with the world and its issues. So when you have language altering your perceptions, then you see something anew and you can see it with fresh eyes or with different eyes. And I really like this idea, and I believe others like it too. And it is also why some authors contributed to the book, even though I think they were scared to write a poem and had never written a poem before. But that lure, that power of poetry and the power of art in a lot of ways sort of got them, including Mike, over the hump, so to speak.
A number of times in the book, you use the phrase, the poetry of lament. So I'm wondering, what is specific about the poetry of lament that sets it apart?
Well, each chapter has a poetic lament, if you will, and each author writes a reflection in a few pages about their poem. And some people contributed one poem, some people contributed two or three. The reflections were not necessarily meant to explicate the poems or to explain what they were about, but rather to describe the experiences and emotions that led to the production of that poetry. And I think that's why we work towards lament, because it invoked an emotion that thematically connected all the chapters, but at the same time offered an opportunity for the poems to go in various directions and experiences.
Mike, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I'd been reading and then I passed it on to Phil, and he read Walter Brueggemann's Reality, Grief, Hope. It's a really interesting theological volume. And it just so happens that Walter Brueggemann passed away just last year, only a couple of months before the book was released. But he writes a book about the city of Jerusalem when it was destroyed, and the book of Lamentations that is written about that. And he titled the book Reality, Grief, Hope. The basic idea was that the Israelites believed nothing bad could ever happen to Jerusalem. And the prophet Jeremiah kept saying, the army's coming, we're going to get invaded. This is coming, guys, like buckle up. And then it eventually did. And so reality ended up catching up. And when it did, there was tremendous lament. And Brueggemann makes the argument that hope is on the other side of that lament can actually open the door to see the world as it truly is, not according to the false ideologies that are present. And so in Climate of Lament, we want to borrow that structure from Brueggemann and look at climate change. You see all the scientists of the world saying, wake up, look what's coming. It's right here in front of you. The evidence is clear. And yet, for some reason, we keep holding on to so many of those false ideologies. And so we use a bit of the introduction to paint that reality, grief, hope structure. And then you have all the poems and reflections. And in the conclusion, we take a stab at what some of these ideologies are that are actually causing the lament in the first place.
I'm sure that you're familiar with the work of Timothy Beale. He's been on the podcast, and he also relies on Brueggemann on that same model. And I want to read you something that he wrote in his book called When Time is Short, Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene. He writes about the book, I feel a little uneasy and self-conscious to be putting this book out there. Is it because I worry that it could be a buzzkill, or that it actually sounds crazy? Or is it because my conflict avoidant personality is once again in conflict with my desire to pursue uncomfortable questions? Yes, and yes. But I suspect that something else is going on. I suspect that I have so deeply internalized the denial I'm writing about that part of me wants to censor my own words. I want to police my own thoughts as not only unbelievable, but unthinkable. Denial is strong enough in and around me that I'm fighting against my own will to break through. And I understand his tension. When you want to face reality, you want to speak openly and honestly about the crisis that we're in, about the cost to the earth of environmental degradation. It can make you sound crazy, and it can make people push back because the tendency is to want to always reach for the hope, right? Find some way to see a better future. I'm wondering if in these early days you have sensed any resistance on the part of potential readers to this idea that really the book is focused on lament.
Well, of course, I sit in the role as a dean of a school of business, and I've written a book about Climate of Lament. And so, we're in Canada, so there's a lot more openness to climate change and a real understanding of some of those realities. But nonetheless, some of those paradigms of profit maximization tend to dominate in economic circles. So it's kind of fun, but I have a regular group of deans of business that we meet with, and I've been sharing about this book. It's fun to share with them because they're intrigued by it, but you can also kind of read in their eyes. They're like, are you crazy? You're writing what? So I get a little bit of it. Canadians are very kind, so we don't get a whole lot of that form of resistance, and it leads to good dialogue. But I do expect as this goes out and as more and more people read it, that, some of the reactions, especially as it goes across the United States, where climate denialism is perhaps the dominant paradigm. That's not the case here, but yeah, I think there will be people that are a little shocked by it.
I also think that people who read the book, it doesn't have to be read in one sitting. It's not a novel. It's not even a collection of essays, so to speak, that are of a particular length. It's meant to be picked up and read at your leisure. And so, yes, it's possible if you read it from beginning to end, there'd be a temptation to feel somewhat overwhelmed by it all. But at the same time, you could pick up and read 2 or 3 short chapters, read the laments, read the reflections. And over time, as you begin to notice the range of emotions that the authors reflect, you could begin to see hope in lament as it's carried out across these various disciplines and countries and cultures. And I do think that lament reflects the power of art. And I find hope in art and creativity, and I think the contributors see that as well.
Forrest, I'm curious. You wrote a phenomenal foreword for the book. I'm curious, as you read the poems, if you experienced some of that yourself. Like, what were you wrestling with as you were reading it?
I actually felt very affirmed because I get in trouble sometimes when I talk to people about facing reality. I'll be honest, I had a friend of mine whose son had been telling him that he was having second thoughts about having children, bringing children into the world, given where the world was headed. And my friend, his father, was really beside himself. He just couldn't imagine that you could make such a decision or that even such a reality was coming. So, our tension was around, how do you balance an awareness of what's coming, facing squarely the facts of climate change with decisions that you make in defiance of that, right? In defiance of the despair. So I actually found the book very refreshing because it was so honest. That's what it felt like. It felt like an honest book. And as people were sharing their hearts through the poetry and then reflecting on the poetry through their essays, I just think they made a really good case for a more honest kind of hope. Yeah, that's what I came away with. Yeah, so I was very happy to write the foreword for the book for that reason. Well, for both of you, I'd really like to know about your personal connection. You've told us some things already, but maybe the best way to get at your connection to the book would be to have you read a passage from your writing and then maybe comment on it a bit.
Well, my poem is not very long, so I'll read the poem and then I'll read part of the reflection. The storm. There is a nagging persistence that everything is not quite right. The unpredictable apprehension keeps me awake. The first sign was a canoe swirling in the sudden storm. Then a pine tree, uprooted, flew by the window. It seemed consciously malevolent, like the poked beast in Pratt's whale-ray poem, who now has finally had enough. I stay vigilant. It can only get worse, I assume. We are not dissuading its anger. Other issues take precedence. I am full of dread. My poem comes out of a lot of Canadian literary theory, and I know we have a lot of American contributors, but the way Canada in the literary imagination thinks often about nature not as something to be conquered, but actually almost like a monster, that it's malevolent, that in many ways it's out to get you. And there's lots of literary history where people disappear without a trace and things happen. And that's what my poem's about. I was at my family's cottage in northern Ontario and this storm just came up. It was quite terrifying and it lasted 2 minutes and then it was gone and everybody just carried on. So that's where my reflection came from. And it also indicates, I think, in a lot of Canadian imaginations, there's always this lurking kind of feeling that something's going to happen, and you're never quite sure what it is. So that's what prompted my particular lament, but also prompted me to think about a reflection that indicated my literary leanings at the same time.
How about you, Michael?
Well, I will read mine, but again, I'm not a poet. I had quite a journey with this process. I had initially worked on a poem connecting resource extraction in West Virginia to Alberta, and it was very heady. People had to keep telling me, Mike, your poem doesn't have to rhyme. It was a little Dr. Seussy, right? But it didn't have a lot of emotion to it. And then for the entire time I've been at King since 2008, I've been visiting Jasper National Park, which is just mind-blowingly beautiful. I've been taking students there in physical geography classes. So we talk about deep time, we talk about mountain formation, we talk about climates, ecosystems, all kinds of things in this beautiful place. And then it burned just a couple of years ago. And so I think it was the summer of 2024 that it burned. That fall, I wasn't able to take my class to Jasper. But the next spring I did. I teach the course twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And I take students to the Moline Canyon overlook. We usually hike through the beautiful gorge and we talk about all kinds of amazing things. But when I showed back up there for the first time after the fire, it was a different place. It was an emotional moment for me. The students picked up on it. And just a few short weeks after that, I decided to change my poem. Most of the book was completed by the time I did this, but I changed my poem to talk about that moment. And so here it is. It's called I Saw You Coming. I saw you coming before you turned the last bend. Not the professor with the lesson on lateral moraine, nor the man reading glacial stories in the canyon walls, but you, older now, exuding silence where there had been wonder. You knew what had happened. I felt your knowing in the way you stepped, cautious, like the ground might remember you, and ache. You've brought them again, your students, though they do not yet see me. They see ash. They see closure signs. They see the bare geometry of loss. But I remember how you used to speak of me. My furs feathered in light. The frost tucked like a secret beneath the spruce roots. The V carved by meltwater, the U a cradle shaped by ice. You remember too, and that is why I have come. I was cathedral and classroom, cool breath rising from limestone lungs. Your students knelt to photograph lichen, bear scat, the braided streambread, not knowing how many generations it took for the moss to climb those north-facing stones, not knowing I listened to each question they asked aloud. Then the poem goes on to get into some of the detail of the fire and what it is now, and I'll just sort of skip to the end here. Now they come, your students. They do not kneel, they do not climb, they stay close to the overlook, as if afraid the valley might take them too. But you stay, and I remember you. The ash is all you see, but beneath it roots are already listening. Fireweed presses upward through the cinders. The mycelium did not die. It waits, networked in patience beneath your feet. Limestone does not mourn the way a tree does, but even stone remembers how to hold a seed. You will not see forests yet, but they will come. In decades, not days. The valley is not gone, it is only bare. And even that is a kind of prayer. So teach them not only how the glaciers and streams carved me, or why the boreal burns, teach them to listen for the voices that remain. Tell them, I am still here. And so I take that and in the reflection talk a little bit about fire in Alberta and fire in the national parks. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem here. It always has been. Indigenous peoples did prescribed burn, so it's a really important part. There are some trees that will only replicate with fire, right? So fire is normal. But what is happening now is very different. The soils are drying out, the pace of the fire is changing, and it's going to be a different future in terms of fire. It's a rare few weeks in the summer when we're not saturated with smoke. And even when we're down in Washington at the El Sabo class, we go up on Hurricane Ridge, it's often smoky now because our climate is drying and warming.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate both of your readings, and both of them are so clearly personal to you. Philip, yours is so literary and rich in depth, and Michael, yours is very geographical. Yeah, so I love that. It makes me wonder if in these examples, people are going to find permission to do this very thing. They're going to find permission to use this format, this poetry of lament, to actually begin to express themselves, to explore their feelings, to even begin to discover what it is they're for. Is that the hope?
Well, that's certainly mine. And that's why I was discussing earlier just what I believe about the power of poetry. I mean, look at Mike's example. I don't want to write a poem. I don't want to write a poem. And then Mike writes one of the longest poems in the book. So I do think there's hope in community and in art. And that's a big part of why I wanted to work on the book, and also what kept me going, because of course, any academic adventure, involves a lot of tedious work at the same time and editing and so forth. But the poems always were the part that I enjoyed, right? That when I was going through the editing process, I would be looking at the reflections and I'd be looking for the grammar because that's what I do. But the poems themselves, I tried to leave them alone as much as possible. Some advice in terms of rhyme meter, those types of instances. I read them over and over and over and over again. And each time I felt rejuvenated and quite happy with them and felt like I knew the people who wrote them, even though I hadn't actually met them in person.
My favorite poem in the book is actually from a student that accompanied me on a geography field trip in Jasper long before the fires. And I did not know this at the time. She writes about it very clearly in the reflection, and you can pick up on it in the poetry, that at the time she was actively suicidal, that she was just trying to stay through. There was relationship stuff going on, all this just depressing stuff in the world. And I had given them the task to go out and write a poem. So we sent them out on Pyramid Lake in Jasper, which was not burned. You can still go up there, a beautiful reflective lake, can see Pyramid Mountain. And Liana sat there, and she had been just not allowing herself to access many of her own emotions for self-protection from things that had happened to her, which she talks about in the reflection. And she wrote a poem. And then we came back together as a class, and she shared the poem quite emotionally, received, an incredible response to it, and then decided to publish this work. And the reason it's so powerful for me is because I walk with so many young adults. You shared your friend whose kids are hesitant about having children. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're asking huge questions about what we're leaving them as future generations. And so hers is actually one of the more hopeful poems because she works through that process. And so, yeah, that's probably my favorite one in the volume, and maybe one of the most vulnerable. It's hard to read. I can't read it without getting quite emotional still. But again, I was with her on the trip, and you just don't know what other people are going through at any given time.
Yeah, no doubt. I think, too, there's a sense in the book that this poetry is being offered in community by community. There's a sense that these aren't poems that are meant to be read and shared and even joined in terms of its quality of lament. Is that something I'm picking up on that's correct?
I would definitely say that's the case. In fact, Joanne Moyer's poem in the volume is actually a liturgy. So it is meant to be done in community. And, it's interesting to do a volume like this. Most of these authors we've never met and haven't met one another, but even through simply reading the poems, I think you get a real sense of who someone is and their heart and their passion for the environment, for creation, and for other people. Quite a few of them have an indigenous spirit to them. One of them talks about residential school children and the graves that have been recently found outside of residential schools. So there's a real human side to this in addition to an environmental side.
And I think also that there's a lot of people writing out of urban spaces as well. People talking about their backyard and their backyard in relation to their neighbors and those sorts of things. And those are just as important and just as powerful.
So Forrest, we've worked together through my El Sabo courses, and you've been such a phenomenal mentor. So thank you for that presence. But we were looking for a second forward in the volume, and you came to mind in light of the passion that your regular listeners hear from you all the time. And so we would love for you, if you don't mind, to read a little bit of your own forward.
Sure. I really struggled with whether or not I should share this story because it is so personal, but that is the feeling that the book evoked in me because it was so raw, so authentic in that sense. So here's part of the forward. When I was a university student, my mother, at the age of 42, died suddenly of what the medical examiner termed an accidental overdose of alcohol and prescription medication. What all her children also knew to be true, though, was that her death was a culmination of years of abuse at the hands of my father. After the funeral, I retreated to the place where I always went when I most needed the presence of God, to the wilderness around Lake Kavanaugh in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. As I walked through the forest, I wept aloud, venting my grief. But when I reached the top of the hill where the trail began to descend, I was shocked to see that the entire valley below had been clear-cut. I continued through the wasteland of stumps and charred burn piles to find the river below, already choked with debris and silt from the eroding hillsides. Devastated, the only response that seemed right was to give shape to a song of lament, to compose a poem that would give voice to my grief, as well as what I imagined to be the grief of this place in the local community. The act of writing a lament connected me to the deep anger I felt about the abuse of the valley, but also, it turned out, about the abuse of my mother. When I shared my poem with those close to me, Invariably, the song brought our common feelings into the open and created a cathartic space where we shared our loss as community. Importantly, I came to understand that my community of lament also included the more than human beings in the family of creation who helped shape my words and lent form to my feelings. As Indigenous theologian Randy Woodley put it when I told him this story, nature mourned with me. Nature mourned for me. The act of composing poetry in concert with creation thus helped me to discover my heart's cry and showed me to myself. So, yeah, that is my personal connection to the book. That part of me that has come to know that even as I can and ought to be grieving with creation, that it's reciprocal, that creation can also grieve with me. So I was grateful for the book for reviving that understanding in me. We have faced the need for lament. We have engaged with grief. And I think then that allows us to move forward into a more authentic sensibility of hope. So I'm wondering from both of you, where do you find hope enough now to press on in your care and advocacy for creation?
I find it in community and in art. I find a lot of it in the classroom. I mean, part of it is because that's my profession. But I do see students and younger students actively and willingly engaging with complex issues and not hiding from them, but sort of trying to work their way through them. And most importantly, understand the language that's necessary in order to resist a lot of the things that are problematic. And I also like to think there are a lot of smart and caring people in the world. And hopefully I teach some of them as well, and they go on to do great things. And they will help keep us from going over the brink. And that there are a lot of people committed to action, and that we can't always be subdued through media or politics or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. How about you, Michael?
Yeah, mine is a bit academic, my response to this question, and it goes back to Brueggemann and some of the isms that are creating this lament in the first place. And I always cautious, I'm speaking as a dean of business, but certainly the form of corporate shareholder capitalism that we have now is not good for people and is not good for creation. And there are a lot of people lamenting right now around the world. The level of destruction, it's just reaching new levels that is frightening and horrifying, and is an opportunity for us to enter into lament. And in that lament, perhaps we can see the world as it is, and we can see that what used to be the noble purpose of the market, what used to be a market that would help all people, that was good for society, we've lost touch with that. And there's a few people getting insanely rich at the expense of the rest of the world. Another ism that is identified many times in the book is colonialism and the history of racism. And Jeremiah Bashirik's poem in particular on whiteness is quite profound and eye-opening. And so I guess the idea of hope is that lament can become a pathway for that. That as we choose to be vulnerable and choose to allow other people into our laments and into our heart and into our grief, that perhaps they'll be able to see the world as it is too. And I find hope in that.
We've been in conversation with Philip Mingay and Michael Ferber about a newly released collection of poems and essays called Climate of Lament.
Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood.
For more
Our
information
executive
about the
producer
book,
is
you can
James
go to the show
Amidon,
notes
and our
for this
sound
episode.
engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levkin Potovsky. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform, and be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.